Hi everybody, and welcome to my presentation on classical liberalism and the environment. This is a presentation for House NAR's May term Austrian economics class for 2015, and this is of course at Westminster College. My name is Karson, and I'd really just like to talk about this because I think it's a really interesting perspective to take, and I'll get more into my interests through the video. Now, it shouldn't be surprising news to anyone that there's already a number of environmental threats occurring. Among those are climate change, overfishing, ozone depletion, nitrogen cycle disruption, and the list just goes on, deforestation, etc. And I'm sure everyone's aware of at least some of these issues. So the question isn't, even at this point, usually where do they exist? It's more of how do we stop them without capsizing our economy or imposing needless regulation. Now, before I get into any further economic theory, I'd like to talk about a concept called the tragedy of the commons. This is a very critical piece of environmental economics because it kind of gets to the very foundation of public resources and externalities. Now, the idea is that the commons are resources that are unowned by individuals, so they're basically like the public lands or the wilderness, and they're completely open to exploitation because there's no management or oversight. So just for an example, say there's 5 people living on an island, and there's an unowned forest. No one's laid claims to it. Since no one owns the forest and will replant the trees or can charge for it, there's no cost of cutting down the trees, right? You just go and chop down a tree. And say everybody gets the same amount of utility for it, whether they're using the trees for firewood or for lumber for their houses, whichever. But there's no cost associated with that. Now, since there's no cost associated, there's no marginal cost curve. Of course, the marginal utility curve would say that the more trees they cut down, the less utility it gives, but without any marginal cost to find an equilibrium point, people just keep cutting them down to maximize their utility to the fullest. Now, this leads to indefinite deforestation because there's no utility. And now this is a real-world scenario, of course. Easter Island, for one, is generally theorized to the fall of Easter Island is generally thought to have been because the entire island was deforested, and a number of ecological issues occur at that point. But this is the tragedy of the commons. You can kind of see where this starts to interplay into environmental economics. Now, the traditional approach to dealing with the tragedy of the commons and environmental externalities in general is regulation. Now, let me give you a scenario. First, there's, say, all companies seek to maximize profit. That's their sole incentive. Without regulation or oversight, they have no accountability. This is, again, the traditional perspective. And this reckless use of resources, whether that's polluting rivers or whether it's burning carbon fuels or, I don't know, maybe even deforestation again. But this leads to major problems down the road for the entire society. And then these risks create negative or emerge as negative externalities, which adversely affect human health and the entire environment. Now, in order to protect these lives, then the state has to prevent the company from taking these risks. Because again, if the company's only motive is to maximize profit, they're not going to hinder their profit for environmental protection. So this is the traditional approach. This has been kind of environmentalism for the past, I guess, since the environmental movement really started, was that using state authority to regulate. Now, the Austrian economics approach is different. It's kind of as you'd expect. It's similar to other Austrian economic approaches to deregulation. Now, the first idea in this is that ownership preempts stewardship. So if I don't own something, I don't want to protect that. You could use the example of a garden. I have more interest in protecting and nurturing my own personal garden because I will receive all of the fruits of the labor versus a public garden where you have to share and other people might not take care of it. So the private public land sphere is very different in this argument. Now, the other important idea is that government agencies don't have liability for some of the environmental damages. To give you an example, the Department of Defense a few years ago was in trouble because they had nuclear waste and chemical waste depositories that fell out of maintenance. and those became toxic to the environment, and some people filed suit, but the case was ruled against them because the government owned the land, so they had no responsibility to the individuals who were harmed. So the Austrian approach would also say deregulate that and make sure that you can hold in those. If an individual doesn't take care of, say, a nuclear waste mine, then they could be held accountable versus the government not being able to be held accountable. So that's kind of the key point here, is accountability. So the Austrians would say hand the public land down to the private sector, whether that's nonprofit organizations or for-profit organizations, who have more interest in protecting that. Now let's look at a quick example. Let's compare the Utah Bureau of Land Management and the Utah Nature Conservancy. Of course, I'm choosing Utah because it's my home state. More importantly, it's where it's the kind of the key point between a large public lands debate. The Utah Public Lands Act is trying to take back a substantial amount of federal land from the federal government to return to the state's own management agency. Now, the Bureau of Land Management is a tremendously large bureaucracy, manage a large amount of land across the United States. And the Austrians would say that because there's such a large bureaucracy, they lack accountability. They allow oil exploration, they allow mineral consumption. Basically, they don't have the same. They do have some regulations to enforce environmental regulations, but they don't have the same degree that, say, the Nature Conservancy does. Now, the Nature Conservancy is an environmental nonprofit who manages a lands trust, so donors gift them lands and resources to maintain and revitalize those lands. Now, you can think of the competitive market theory kind of enters the picture here. Because it is even though it's a nonprofit, because it has to compete for the same resources as other nonprofits, the Nature Conservancy does have a high degree of accountability, and that's stakeholders and donors. If they don't do a good job, then donors will fire them, so to speak. So you can see that the Nature Conservancy does have a really great incentive to do their job. Not to say that the Bureau of Land Management doesn't, but the Nature Conservancy has a very direct penalty for mismanaging land. So to summarize everything, the Austrian economists, you would think, were not necessarily environmentalists, and often they were more concerned with business, but I hope this kind of illustrates how the two ideas can be coexistent, that those same theories that apply to market regulation for the financial sector can also apply to the environmental realm. Now, the main points here are that private interests protect land better because they're more because they can be held accountable versus the Bureau of Land Management or the Department of Defense, who cannot be held accountable as well. And then secondly, that the state has less incentive than competitive nonprofits or for-profits, because they can't just be easily fired if somebody doesn't do their job well. You have the same issue with bureaucracy here. And then finally, the purpose is really to prevent these externalities from occurring rather than mitigating them. So the Nature Conservancy would not allow an oil well to be established on their land versus the Bureau of Land Management, which might allow it to be established, and then they'd have to face the consequences of, say, it spilling over and contaminating water supplies. So it really is trying to stop the problem before it begins. So from this video, I hope you've gained a little bit of insight into, I think, a really interesting concept and a really useful tool, I think, when it comes to environmental policy. So thanks for watching. Bye.